Robinson is able to survive his solitude because he's lucky. He makes peace with his condition because he's ordinary, and his island is concrete. David, who was extraordinary, and whose island was virtual, finally had nothing but his own interesting self to survive on. And the problem with making a virtual world of oneself is akin to the problem with projecting ourselves onto a cyber world. There's no end of virtual spaces in which to seek stimulation, but their very endlessness, the perpetual stimulation without satisfaction, becomes imprisoning. To be everything and more is the Internet's ambition, too. The vertiginous point where I turned back in the rain was less than a mile from La Cuchara, but the return hike took 2 hours. The rain was now not just horizontal but heavy, and I was having trouble staying upright in the wind. The GPS unit was giving me low battery messages, but I had to keep turning it on because visibility was so poor that I couldn't maintain a straight line. Even when the unit showed that the refugio was 150 feet away, I had to walk farther before I could make out its roofline. I tossed my drenched knapsack into the refugio, ran down to my tent, and found it a basin of rainwater. I managed to wrestle out the foam mattress and get it back to the refugio, and then I went back and unstaked the tent and poured off the water and gathered the whole thing in my arms, trying to keep the things inside it halfway dry, and hustled it back uphill through the horizontal rain. The refugio was a disaster zone of soaked clothes and equipment. I spent 2 hours on various drying projects, followed by an hour of searching the promontory, to no avail, for a critical piece of tent hardware that I'd lost in my mad dash. And then, in a matter of minutes, the rain ended and the clouds blew off, and I realized I'd been staying in the most dramatically beautiful spot I'd ever seen. It was late afternoon, and the wind was blowing out over the insanely blue ocean, and it was time. La Cuchara seemed more suspended in the air than attached to the earth. There was a feeling of near infinity, the sun eliciting from the hillsides more shades of green and yellow than I'd suspected the visible spectrum of containing, a dazzling near infinity of colors, and the sky so immense that I wouldn't have been surprised to see the mainland on the eastern horizon. White shreds of remnant cloud came barreling down from the summit, whipped past me and vanished. The wind was blowing out, and I began to cry because I knew it was time, and I hadn't prepared myself, had managed to forget. I went to the refugio and got the little box of David's ashes, the booklet, to use the term he'd amusingly applied to his not-short book about mathematical infinity, and walked back down the promontory with it, the wind at my back. I was doing a lot of different things at every moment. Even as I was crying, I was also scanning the ground for the missing piece of my tent, and taking my camera out of my pocket and trying to capture the celestial beauty of the light and the landscape, and damning myself for doing this when I should have been purely mourning, and telling myself that it was okay that I'd failed in my attempt to see the Rayadito in what would surely be my only visit to the island, that it was better this way, that it was time to accept finitude and incompleteness and leave certain birds forever unseen, that the ability to accept this was the gift I'd been given and my beloved dead friend had not. At the end of the promontory, I came to a pair of matching boulders that together formed a kind of altar. David had chosen to leave the people who loved him and give himself to the world of the novel and its readers, and I was ready to wish him well in it. I opened the box of ashes and threw them up into the wind. Some bits of gray bone came down on the slope below me, but the dust was caught in the wind and vanished into the blue vault of the sky, blowing out across the ocean. I turned and wandered back up the hill toward the refugio, where I would have to spend the night because my tent was disabled. I felt done with anger, merely bereft, and done with islands, too. Riding with me on the boat back to Robinson Crusoe were 1,200 lobsters, a couple of skinned goats, and an old lobsterman who, after the anchor had been weighed, shouted to me that the sea was very rough. Yeah, I agreed, it was a little rough. No poco, he shouted seriously, mucho. The boat's crew were tossing around the bloody goats, and I realized that instead of heading straight back toward Robinson, we were angling 45 degrees to the south to keep from capsizing. I staggered down into a tiny, fetid bunk room beneath the bow and heaved myself onto a bunk, and there, After an hour or two of clutching the sides of the bunk to avoid becoming airborne, and trying to think about anything that wasn't seasickness, and sweating off, as I later discovered, the anti-seasickness patch I'd stuck behind my ear, and listening to water slosh and hammer against the hull, I threw up into a Ziploc bag. 10 hours later, when I ventured back out on deck, I was expecting the harbor to be in sight, but the captain had done so much tacking that we were still 5 hours away. I couldn't face returning to the bunk, and I was still too sick to look at seabirds, and so I stood for 5 hours and did little but imagine changing my return flight, which I'd booked for the following week to allow for delays, and going home early. I hadn't felt so homesick since possibly the last time I'd camped by myself. In 3 days, the Californian woman I live with would be going out to watch the Super Bowl with friends of ours, and when I thought of sitting beside her on a sofa and drinking a martini and rooting for the Green Bay quarterback Aaron Rodgers, who'd been a star at Berkeley, I felt desperate to escape the islands. Before leaving for Masafuera, I'd already seen Robinson's 2 endemic landbird species, and the prospect of another week there, with no chance of seeing something new, seemed suffocatingly boring, an exercise in deprivation from the very busyness that I'd been so intent on fleeing, a busyness whose pleasurability I appreciated only now. Back on Robinson, I enlisted my innkeeper, Ramon, to try to get me on one of the following day's flights. Both flights turned out to be full, but while I was eating lunch, the local agent of one of the air companies happened to walk into the inn, and Ramon pressed her to let me fly on a third cargo-only flight. The agent said no. "But what about the co-pilot seat?" Ramon asked her. "Couldn't he sit in the co-pilot seat?" "No," the agent said. "The co-pilot seat, too, would be filled with cartons of lobster." And so, although I no longer wanted it, or because I didn't want it, I had the experience of being truly stranded on an island. I ate the same bad Chilean white bread at every meal, the same nondescript fish served without sauce or seasoning at every lunch and dinner. I lay in my room and finished Robinson Crusoe. I wrote postcards in reply to the stack of mail I'd brought along. I practiced mentally inserting into Chilean Spanish the S's that its speakers omitted. I got better views of the Juan Fernandez fire crown, a splendid, large, cinnamon-colored hummingbird severely endangered by invasive plant and animal species. I hiked over the mountains to a grassland where the island's annual cattle branding festival was being held. And I watched horseback riders drive the village's herd into a corral. The setting was spectacular: sweeping hills, volcanic peaks, white-capped ocean. But the hills were denuded and deeply gouged by erosion. Of the 100-plus cattle, at least 90 were malnourished, the majority of them so skeletal it seemed remarkable that they could even stand up. The herd had historically been a reserve source of protein, and the villagers still enjoyed the ritual of roping and branding. But couldn't they see what a sad travesty the ritual had become? With 3 more days to fill, and my knees worn out by downhill hiking, I had no choice but to start reading Samuel Richardson's first novel, Pamela, which I'd brought along mainly because it's a lot shorter than Clarissa. All I'd known about Pamela was that Henry Fielding had satirized it in Shamala, his own first venture into novel writing. I hadn't known that Shamala was only one of many works published in immediate response to Pamela, and that Pamela, indeed, had been possibly the biggest news of any kind in London in 1741. But as soon as I started reading it, I could see why. The novel is compelling and electric with sex and class conflicts, and it details psychological extremes at a level of specificity like nothing before it. Pamela Andrews isn't everything and more. She's simply and uniquely Pamela, a beautiful servant girl whose virtue is under sustained and ingenious assault by the son of her late employer. Her story is told through her letters to her parents, and when she finds out that these letters are being intercepted and read by her would-be seducer, Mr. B, she continues to write them while knowing that Mr. B will read them. Pamela's piousness and self-dramatizing hysterics were bound to infuriate a certain kind of reader. One of the books published in response satirized Richardson's subtitle, Virtue Rewarded, as Feigned Innocence Detected. But underneath her strident virtue and Mr. B's lascivious machinations is a fascinatingly rendered love story. The realistic power of this story was what made the book such a groundbreaking sensation. Defoe had staked out the territory of radical individualism, which has remained a fruitful subject for novelists as late as Beckett and Wallace, but it was Richardson who first granted full fictional access to the hearts and minds of individuals whose solitude has been overwhelmed by love for someone else. Exactly halfway through Robinson Crusoe, when Robinson has been alone for 15 years, he discovers a single human footprint on the beach and is literally made crazy by the fear of man. After concluding that the footprint is neither his own nor the devil's, but rather some cannibal intruder's, he remakes his garden island into a fortress, and for several years he can think of little but concealing himself and repelling imagined invaders. He marvels at the irony that I, whose only affliction was that I seemed banished from human society, that I was alone, circumscribed by the boundless ocean, cut off from mankind, and condemned to what I called silent life, that I should now tremble at the very apprehensions of seeing a man, and was ready to sink into the ground at but the shadow or silent appearance of a man's having set his foot in this island. Nowhere was Defoe's psychology more acute than in his imagination of Robinson's response to the rupture of his solitude. He gave us the first realistic portrait of the radically isolated individual, and then, as if impelled by novelistic truth, he showed us how sick and crazy radical individualism really is. No matter how carefully we defend ourselves, all it takes is one footprint of another real person to recall us to the endlessly interesting hazards of living relationships. Even Facebook, whose users collectively spend billions of hours renovating their self-regarding projections, contains an ontological exit door, the relationship status menu, among whose options is the phrase, "It's complicated." This may be a euphemism for "on my way out," but it's also a description of all the other options. As long as we have such complications, how dare we be bored?